Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pod and the Pendulum, your horror movie podcast that is covering all horror movie franchises, one movie and one episode at a time. I'm your host, Mike Snoonian, joined once again by my co-host, Jerry Smith. Jerry, how are we doing?
I'm doing absolutely great. I'm excited about this one. You know what's funny is I just noticed that I say that before every episode.
You really do.
It's so silly. But like honestly, this is an episode that I think after last week's episode, people were like, "Whoa, you know, this was not very positive." No, but I've been looking forward to doing Halloween 2 for a while because I think it's I think it's one of the most interesting of the sequels. So this is gonna be cool.
I unabashedly love this movie, which is really funny considering that last week we were both really down on the original Rob Zombie Halloween, like the initial. So usually you would think, you know, people like the first foray and then everything kind of goes downhill, but I really like this movie a lot. It's actually the first movie I ever wrote about for my old site, All Things Horror.
Wow.
So I really enjoyed it. And I remember reading reviews afterwards being like, oh, I guess I'm so new I didn't get the memo that you're not allowed to like this movie. But it does feel like it's gotten like a reevaluation over the past couple years.
Oh, totally.
As all Halloween sequels tend to over time.
Mm-hmm. And I also think that it's awesome. Speaking on that reevaluation and stuff, I think our guest tonight is the perfect person to talk about it because he's somebody that has championed this movie right from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I mean, even in recent times, covering the movie and stuff. So I'm excited.
So why don't you introduce our guest right now, Jerry?
Okay, we have returning guest and great friend of the show, Justin Beahm, on to talk about Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. How's it going, man?
Doing great, guys. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. It's nice to be back. And this, what you're saying about Halloween 2 and its sort of complicated history, I think is on point and makes for really great discussion. So I'm thrilled that you guys are giving it some attention.
Ooh, what was going on back there?
Sorry, I just had a TV thing going up. My bad, sir. Apologies. I'm sorry. So sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's gonna be fun because we're working against deadline, and I'm like debating in my head: do I actually edit this episode, or is everyone?
Can I come along and fuck it up?
So you're going to
exactly how it goes.
Works in all episode, but that's okay. That is absolutely okay.
You know what? It is raining outside, and I'm recording my part in a car, so I think we're along for a ride in general.
So Jerry is in a hotel tonight because there are blackouts everywhere in California. So they are in a hotel. Justin has just done like a 5-hour car ride and has basically like rushed home so he could be part of this show.
Yeah.
I'm just like I'm hampered by just being me, just like the day-to-day drudgery that is basically in my own incompetence and foibles. So everyone is getting like a pretty raw show tonight overall. But
that and like up until a few days ago, I was really looking forward to this episode. Just for the fact that it was one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen. Still, but then I went to see Cats. And I sincerely think, without any irony or even joking in my voice, that was the weirdest damn movie I've ever seen, and I'm strangely in love with it for that reason.
Yeah, because you want to go again, and I think that there needs to be an intervention. I think no.
No, I want to go again because I want to go again because they just announced that they're sending every theater a new version starting tonight with updated special effects. And that's like such a...
Yeah.
The director was working on it, like I think up until like 4 hours before the premiere and still wasn't satisfied. So the version that I saw and the other people that watched it opening week, like that version's not going to exist after tonight. They're like,
wow.
Like, has that been done before other than like The Shining?
There were talks I was reading tonight. I think it was Julie Muncie on either IO9 or AV Club posted an article with some of the issues with the cut that's in theaters right now. And it was like, Judi Dench's hands can be seen. Like you have like one hand that's feline, one hand that's not. There were scenes
and
you
the feet.
see like the feet dragging. I think some people were wearing like New Balance sneakers instead of having cat feet. So it's like, it is like, I mean, what a weird fucking time.
No, but honestly, like, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Halloween 2, obviously. But sitting there in the theater watching Cats, it was like my wife and I think 2 other people in the entire theater. Like the night before it opened, you know, I thought it would be packed. It was just us. And there were so many times where I really thought, like, you know, like I did acid like in 1995, that long ago. And for a split second, I was like, maybe I'm not watching this. Maybe it's not as weird as in my head. Maybe that's like, you know, residuals. Because it is just like experiencing like Holy Mountain for the first time. It is so weird.
You just compared Cats to Holy Mountain. That needs to be in the show liner notes for this episode.
You know, Tom Hooper, you know, Jodorowsky, you know.
Oh my God.
Growing up, every Christmas Eve, one of my uncles always took like all the kids to a movie. Like he took us to a matinee so that way the parents could get ready for Christmas Day. And like get all the presents ready and whatnot. That's why I saw like Flash Gordon in theaters that way.
Awesome.
Like a bunch of, you know, like Rocky IV in theaters that way. I am so tempted to bring a bunch of the cousins, like all the kids, to like a movie Christmas Eve and start that tradition again and tell them we're seeing Star Wars, but really take them to see Cats.
Yes.
You know, and just like.
And then in all the conversation afterwards, just insist that they actually saw Star Wars.
You know, like Idris, man, like Taylor Swift was playing Darth Vader, man. It was, you know.
Is it true that Taylor Swift actually made new music for this? Like they're not even using the original soundtrack?
You know what's crazy is the song that she and Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote for this is such a significant part of the film. Like it's used in like 3 or 4 huge parts, and the song is amazing. But yeah, brand new song.
Yeah, that's. I guess she said that. I think it might have been the same or a different article where her dad. I guess there's a scene where all of them are on catnip, like they have like an acid scene, and I guess like her dad was the one that suggested that. Like her dad would just. She's like, yeah, when I was like younger, my dad used to sit in all my meetings and like pitch ideas. I'm like, Dad, get the fuck out of here. I think Justin's having a shower right now, which is...
you know, listen, I've had a long 48 hours, guys. I got out of my car, walked inside, and I am in the shower right now. No, I'm not in the shower. But you know what that conversation reminds me of? You guys, have you seen the movie Heavyweights? Do you remember that movie?
Oh, yeah.
That Robert De Niro in Sylvester Stallone.
No. Heavyweights is
it's kids at a fat camp.
Camp. Vince Stiller.
So they have this scene, like it's this normal movie, and it's actually a really good. I like.
Oh, it's great.
It's cute. It's a cute movie, but they have this really bizarre scene that seems out of place, and it's almost like I don't know, like someone with a very specific fetish stepped in to shoot this sequence, because there's a point in the film where all these kids get access to a bunch of snack food, like Twinkies and stuff like that, and they're all out. And it's that's right. And it's like that scene in The Doors where there's that outdoor concert and everyone's dancing around and there's fire and there's naked girls and all this stuff. Well, here's a bunch of like overweight kids just like rubbing Twinkies all over their faces, and they got cream all over their mouths and their chests, and they're like rubbing into each other, and they're dancing around a campfire. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, this is like a fucking cutscene from Caligula. This does not belong in this movie. And I don't know how we got from Cats to there, but there you go.
No, what's funny is
this
just in this episode,
long way of going around to say that Taylor Swift dad is the one that it was like, let's have a scene where the cats are all high as balls, basically.
I think if any of our listeners have like stayed with the song or stayed with the show this long on this episode, then we have them for life. Because in this episode already, we've compared Cats to Holy Mountain and Heavyweights, written by Judd Apatow, to The Doors. So like I'm all in right now.
You are welcome.
This is where we're at. Merry Christmas, everybody. We've had a good run. So Halloween 2.
Oh yeah.
We're here to talk about tonight. Halloween 2. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 specifically. Justin, Jerry had started out by saying you're someone that had kind of championed this movie for a long time. Like, what was it that drew you to this movie initially? I always love asking with that. Like, what was it about this one where you're like, this one is better than its reputation would suggest?
Well, it didn't have a reputation when I saw it. I went on opening day, and I went to the very first screening on opening day with my then girlfriend, and it was kind of an overwhelming experience. I didn't really, because it was such a departure in a lot of ways, that I walked out and I knew I liked it a lot, but I knew I needed to see it again to process it. And I went back again. I can't remember if it was that night or if it was the following night, but I went and saw it immediately again.
Really?
And then I really could like tune into it, which you kind of have to do with this film. You have to like allow yourself to exist in this universe. And I walked out just saying like, this is at this point, I mean, this and Devil's Rejects are Rob's masterpiece films. And in many ways, I like Halloween 2 better than Devil's Rejects because of, for a lot of reasons that I'm sure we're going to explore here over time. But to answer your question about what drew me in was the artistry of it. It is so not the kind of movie that a studio was putting out at that time in the United States.
Yeah.
And it is so not what the genre had been at that point and still isn't. Really outside of like independent and foreign stuff. It's the kind of movie that just it has its own voice and it's bold in the decisions that it makes and it runs with them. And it does a lot of stuff visually that, you could turn the sound off and put on some, it could be a silent film almost and be just as effective because it's so beautiful from front to back.
Where do you stand on 2007's Halloween?
I like the first one from him. It's hard to separate emotion at the time from like the film itself, but I don't think that they need to be necessarily separated. So I will say at the time I was really excited Halloween was back in theaters because at that point we had H2O and then Resurrection, and it was really just kind of sitting there like dead. And once again, the franchise. And so when I heard there was going to be a Halloween remake, I was disappointed because I was like, oh, why? But then when I heard Rob was doing it, I was on board completely because I knew that he would walk in with a vision that would be something different. So what I really liked about his film is that it took a different approach than the original, which is there's no point to make a movie if you don't, right? And then I like that he stepped up. He made this is something I've said a million times, and I'm sorry to anybody who's heard me say it before. He made both of his movies about the monster because just like us, he grew up loving the monster. And so he succeeded in that, especially in part 2. But you can see a divided director in part 1. You can see where he had to have some beats from the original for it to be considered a remake. And the producers were real heavy in his ear. But then there's also the Rob part of it. And you can see when it sort of steps in and out of that shadow, if that makes sense. And in part 2, even though he had infinitely more meddling and fuckery behind the scenes in terms of the production, it is it's like a front to back vision of his and a pure Rob Zombie film. So I like the second one a lot better than the first one, but I do like the first one fine.
Well, what's interesting. Oh no, I was just going to say what I've always found interesting and very fascinating about the movie, the second one, is it almost feels like anything that a lot of people complained about with the first one, not feeling like, the original and just complaints in general. It almost seemed like Rob not flipped them off, but in some way kind of did. It's like, oh, you don't like this about the first one? Well, I'm going to amplify it in the second one. Like there is no question about it that Halloween 2 is 100% Rob's film instead of, a remake of Carpenter's movie that feels a pressure to be Carpenter's movie, but also doing his own thing.
Yeah, and when we talked about Halloween 4, and Justin, you were on for that show too, Symmetry. Right. With Jerry, you were fond of saying like, hey, it's a terrible Halloween movie, but it's a great movie. And I feel like the same way about Halloween 2. Like, it's not a good. I mean, I think the reason it works is because it's such a bad Halloween movie. Because of that, it's a great movie.
Mm-hmm.
If that I don't know if that
Bad
makes
or
any
just
sense.
different. I mean, I don't know that because if you break Halloween as a
That
like, if
is
you
the
break it down
wrong-
to its I was going to say, like, if you break Halloween down to its core elements, this film delivers on all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I would say because it's so like, even when you look at the original series, when you look at say parts 4, 5, and 6, in H2O to a lesser extent, I'm kind of the mind that H2O feels removed from the Carpenter universe, where like the first 6 films, even when they don't necessarily like succeed in some of their elements, they still feel like they're part of that same universe. Like this movie, and we'll go into a lot more detail in it as we go on here, but it feels like completely removed from that universe and not beholden to it in any way, shape, or form. And I think it's because of those things that the movie succeeds so well.
Well, that's how Rob describes it. That's how, because Jerry made a little reference to it earlier. Earlier this year, remarkably, I still don't know how this happened, and neither does Rob. I was just with Rob a few days ago and got him copies of this, but I got a huge interview with him in Scream magazine all about Halloween 2, and it ran over 2 issues. Mm-hmm. And it ended up, I mean, the editor there, as Jerry will attest, is incredible, and he let me just run with the ball, and it's this long thing, but there's a lot of stories to be told from behind the scenes. But the way that Rob describes the sort of legacy of his 2 Halloween entries is that he says to him, it kind of feels like there's the original movies, and then his 2 are kind of off on an island by themselves.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it from that perspective.
Yeah.
And I think it challenges the audience to consider characters they love in a sort of an alternate universe. So, which the Halloween franchise has done over and over again. Now, people love this with Star Wars. People love this with Star Trek and all these other things, right? Why are we not as open to that with this? Because it's, as I've said a million times, and I'm sorry about repeating things, but it's like putting the Halloween franchise, any franchise, putting a model in the middle of the room, and you have 11 people standing around it with paintbrushes and an easel and a canvas. And if you were to circle the room and see how each person was interpreting the model in the middle of the room, they're all going to naturally be different. There's going to be a different take from each of them, because otherwise there's no point to even be creating. And so that's the one thing that it's like, okay, with the Halloween franchise, well, we've now embraced Halloween 3. Great. Awesome. Yeah. Now, we've accepted Michael impregnating his niece. And now we've accepted Jamie Lee and then the whole beheading. Like we've accepted all these things, but this take on Halloween is sacrilegious. Like Rob's, and I even put a post up the other day. I think it was the day after Rob and I were together working on this project together. I put a picture up of us from where we were. And I said, I put up the picture of the parking spaces with our names on them. And I said, now what could Rob and I be up to? And of course, like 4 or 5 people are like, ruining another horror film franchise, I would imagine.
That's dumb.
And I'm so fucking over that whole,
Right.
That's not even a discussion. It is so narrow-minded. And as I've always said, with any remake, no matter how terrible it is, no matter how much you hate it and despise it, that filmmaker is never going to crawl in your window, grab the Blu-ray of the original off your shelf and burn it. I mean, you're always going to have what you had before. So back off.
For the longest time, I was under the kind of thought and mentality of, if this wasn't a Halloween movie, if Halloween 2 wasn't a Halloween movie and it was just its own thing, man, I would really love that movie. And it was only recently that I thought, like, that's really dumb. That's a dumb way of me of thinking, because if I love it for its own thing, like, why shouldn't I just love it in general? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like it's taken me watching that movie so many times. And what's funny is I even watched it, I think, like a month or 2 ago, and still didn't really get it. And I rewatched it this last week, and for some reason, for the first time in like however many years, I was just like, you know what? Like, why not just say this is a really good movie instead of being like, well, this would have been a good movie had it been named something else. It's just a good movie.
Yeah, there's a certain element of doomed to fail built into any kind of entry in a franchise, because there's expectation that's intrinsically tied to the experience. People, if it's a part 2 or a part 11, I mean, people walk in understanding the universe on their terms, and so there's gonna be a natural judgment there. But what I've always challenged everyone to do in every scenario, and I'm not just talking about franchises, about anything, is like allow every film, just like every song, to exist unto itself. Imagine if a band made an album and every single song was the same. You'd be like, fuck this band. Yeah. Because you want diversity, and then you want to allow the artists to flex and expand and change and run with it, because they're artists. Artists don't have a timeline on what they create. And art doesn't have any kind of playbook. So we need to stop being so rigid in our outlook on this stuff. And that's why I've never written reviews, because I just can't, I don't exist in that headspace of casting judgment and then handing it out to people, because I have so much respect for everyone's opinion on everything. If people want to hate something, fine. But, it's not my job to talk them out of their opinion on something, in other words. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's also kind of important and interesting to talk about the fact that Rob, even though there were naysayers on the first film, myself included, obviously, but even with all these people saying things about it, like he was very protective over these characters. He was done after the first film. Done, that was the end. And then, the film was being developed. The writer and directors of Inside came in and were hired to do it. And I remember when that was announced, I was just like, wow, that's an interesting choice. And like I would understand Rob's perspective of like, well, in a lot of ways, Halloween was my movie. I had to do those Carpenter beats, but that was my baby. I can understand why he would want to come back. And it's so interesting that he would come back. And yeah, there was a lot of, meddling and stuff. But with that being said, like, I do feel, and, I even thought this when I wasn't really fond of it, I do feel like Halloween 2 is one of the most auteur-driven horror films in like a long time. Like that is not a studio movie whatsoever.
I think it's really interesting too, because like you had said, when Morrow and Bastillo develop a story that's very, very similar to what the end result ended up being overall. There were the beats that were going to follow the original Halloween 2 overall. There is the ending where the main characters are going to end up dying, including Laurie. But you're going to have all these things that kind of mirror what's going on overall with what Rob Zombie came up with. But he tweaked it and changed it so it was more his own and more so it kind of followed, kind of the vision he had laid out in his first movie overall. And I think there is a little bit of something to be said for, maybe falling on your sword is the wrong word, but, feeling like very protective of the work that you had done before it, and then not wanting someone to come in so quickly to kind of, take away your ownership of it.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say Rob's involvement is a little more complicated than that, because he had a multi-picture deal with Miramax, and
this is during the Tyrannosaurus Rex era, right?
Yeah, because that was to be the next film. It was to follow Halloween with Tyrannosaurus Rex, and that was going to be a boxing movie starring Tyler Mane, and it was this whole thing. But then, in the midst of all of this development on it, they just pulled the plug saying it was going to be too expensive. But then they're like, but don't forget, you still owe us a movie. And that's why Tyler, because he had if you look at Rob's concept art, which I know is floating around out there for T-Rex, you can see everything very, very clearly. And you can see directly why Tyler looked the way he did in part 2, because Rob had him growing out the beard. He had him getting super ripped and like in shape, and having him grow his hair out. And so that was all actually in prep for Tyrannosaurus Rex, which eventually fell apart. And then it came to those conversations. And when he started seeing the stuff that was being kicked around, that's when he made the decision, like you said, to step back into this territory again. And with that certain sense of ownership of these characters, and do something on his own. I mean, having no idea of the nightmare. I mean, he had some idea, but I mean, really, it got insane while he was making this movie, and the conditions that he had to make it under are just insane, especially when you look at the final outcome and the art that's present there.
I mean, the big thing is that what always struck me is like the turnaround time from when he inks the deal to say, all right, I'm going to write and direct this, to when it comes out is something like ridiculous. Isn't it like 8 months?
Yeah.
I mean, it's less than a year. And if I remember correct, he initially thought he'd have at least 2 more months and that he would get another October release. But instead, they make a very curious decision to release this at the end of August, over like Labor Day weekend, if I remember correct, or right near it.
Yeah, no, it wasn't an October release whatsoever.
It's done with no time whatsoever to really form things.
And it was for a long time the top Labor Day box office of all time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that still stands, but for many, many years at least, Halloween 2 was the top performing release historically on that date.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the film itself, I remember being in the theater and I watched it. And right from that opening sequence, everything from Laurie walking down the street bloody to the corners, in the van with the cowl thing and everything leading up to the hospital scene, right from the beginning that this is not going to be what you expected whatsoever. And that even goes to like not what you were expecting after seeing Rob's first film. Like right from the beginning, Halloween 2 is going to be like this trip of a movie, like I remember sitting there and after the coroner scene, when Michael gets out, cuts off Richard Brake's head, and then you see the horse and the mom and stuff. Like it was almost like a Cats experience again, to where I was thinking like, wait, did I take something? Like, what am I watching? Is Michael Myers looking at the ghost of his mom and a horse? Like it right from the beginning that this is not your typical horror film. And, I'm glad that I finally came around, but it's taken me so long to realize, like, kind of like the genius behind those choices. He subverted any expectations that people had going into it.
Yeah, to me, like that first opening scene, and what's funny is a lot of people who kind of sort of like Halloween 2 point to the first act in the hospital as their favorite part of the movie overall. And to me, it's like a huge middle finger overall. It's him saying like, if you want the same movie over and over again, well, you're not going to get it. And that, that dream sequence is just like a middle finger to people overall. And it is... I don't know if an Oscar winner has ever been killed more violently. That's what's funny about it is like Halloween, the 2007 one. I mean, it was violent as hell. But Halloween 2, Michael doesn't kill people; he just obliterates them. Mm-hmm. Everything from Octavia Spencer's death to, man, Jeff Daniel Phillips, like his face in that movie, it's insane. Yeah. To me, it's so brutal, and I think one of the things Jerry and I, when we talked last week about the original Halloween, we talked about how the violence in Zombies movie didn't always seem to have a point. It seemed to be kind of gratuitous for gratuity's sake. Where this one, I felt like a real shift in terms of the tone of the violence. That you're not meant to enjoy it, you're not meant to revel in it, you're not meant to cheer it on. At this point, you're really at this point meant to feel uncomfortable with it. And I think that starts right with Laurie getting like hauled into the hospital and how you just get like these real shocking close-ups of all her, really the battle scars that she's been put in, and just how, like seeing her in a neck brace and seeing her like screaming out like, am I dead? Like that is,
what's crazy awful. Is,
am I going to die? I think is what she screams out over and over. And it's like, I think it's a completely different tone from that first movie. And I think it benefits from it.
Totally. And I feel like if they had put any like little cheesy subtitle on the film instead of just Halloween 2, that would have been the perfect one. Because I think Halloween Battle Scars is 100% what Halloween 2 is. It goes in directions that maybe like I'm not super fond of with Laurie, But with that being said, it is very much a look at what happens after a slasher movie, you know, the aftermath of what happens to someone when they have to deal with it. And, you know, we'll probably get into the different versions later on, but you know, and a lot of like little nitpicks that I originally had with Halloween 2, I think were kind of gotten rid of with the director's cut of Halloween 2, because there's so much different, so much that you could latch onto. You know, there's that scene with the doctor, with Margot Kidder's character. You know, in the theatrical, you know, it's only been 1 year since the events of the first film, but there's like lines like, you know, well, Halloween's always a trigger for you or something like that. So it always felt weird. But in the director's cut, it's been a couple years. So it kind of makes sense. You know, it's more about Laurie's journey in the director's cut, and instead of this kind of truncated, you know, interesting but somewhat truncated version that we saw in theaters.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I completely agree that having that larger gap of time, I think it adds more pathos to the movie overall, and it does make, you know, more sense, you know, in terms of like just how far she's really descended since the first movie.
And like all characters have, you know? No, go for it.
Well, touching back on that opening sequence, and then definitely diving into the whole, like the survivor type thing. I really think that opening sequence is just remarkable in a lot of ways, and it offers a lot to audiences, and it also challenges audiences too. But it's really, really beautiful the way that it's shot, and you know they have, and they're also putting Michael in a situation that we've never seen him in before, which is in the rain. And this sounds like a small thing, but just like we've always wanted Jason in the snow, Michael has been, short of being in the water in part 5. I mean, essentially he looks, well, I mean, the mask, you know, all that stuff, but we are used to seeing Michael a certain way. And when he's out in the elements, for a movie that stands so far, that travels so far into the realm of dreams and almost like, I hate to say fantasy, but for a movie that plays so much in like artistic dream world, Halloween 2 is arguably the most rooted in reality. And that, just by the sheer fact of putting Michael in the rain outside in the beginning as he's smashing his way into that booth, you're seeing him in a position where he could be compromised by the weather. He never has been before. And you're also seeing him look a different way. And there's a ferocity when there's a great shot from inside that shack out that window when he walks by and looks, and his hair is dripping down in his face. That's my favorite Michael Myers sequence outside of the original film, is all that stuff in the rain there. It's really great. And then the chase through the hospital, it does it even plays in some Argento territory there. But the brutality you mentioned in setting things up and the way that it's handled, and as we'll talk about this more, it is kind of next level, but in a way, I think a lot of people miss the fact that it's kind of delivering what they've always wanted. Because the one thing about audiences is that they love to say they want something new, but when they're handed something new, they don't always respond to it. And this was something genuinely different. And I love that from the very beginning, like you said, Jerry, you knew that you were on that trip, and then it felt unsafe because it was in territory that was completely foreign as a Halloween franchise fan. And it seemed even removed from Rob's first film. And that lack of security, I think, is really important to a movie that goes the directions this one does, because you don't want a film. There would be no point that a lot of the power would be lost if you could guess the next beat. And I would argue no one sitting in theaters seeing Halloween 2 for the first time was able to guess any of the upcoming beats.
Totally. And it's also interesting that most slasher films, if they do address what happened to the, you know, final girl, usually the sequel is focused on her and her PTSD and her trauma. But what's so interesting about Halloween 2, like, it shows the aftermath on everyone. You know, I think it's interesting that Rob kept the character of Annie alive, you know, when all of us expected her to die, kind of like Carpenter's, to kind of give her, especially in the director's cut, an arc that is almost as tragic, if not more, than Laurie's.
And giving Sheriff Brackett
Yeah.
one of the most powerful moments in all of horror, but certainly one of the most powerful moments in this franchise when he discovers her toward the end of the film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Brad Dourif in that scene is
Devastating.
It is. And you just feel it. You wear it when you're seeing it, and the way Rob lets it play out. And that's the whole point here, is it does what horror is terrible at doing. And that's showing how people exist after the fact of something horrendous happening like this. I mean, any small element of most of these films would be destructive to anyone, let alone, the scale on which Michael Myers has been murdering people for years, whatever it might be. I mean, I love the fact that the entire town, there's a mythology built around him then too. And you also have Loomis. He's transitioned in this film. So it's not, he's not static either, which is nice. I mean, it's really challenging the audience. And I think that can be very important and very powerful.
Well, it doesn't only address PTSD or trauma too. It addresses a lot of things that survivors go through, like resentment. Annie and Laurie are very close in the first film. And I mean, there's such resentment and not hatred, but sometimes a little between the two because of what happened. I feel like Laurie blames herself for what happened. So there's that aggression. And I feel like Annie, in some ways, she does too, and it's so interesting to see that for non-fans of Rob's work, or just, a lot of people in general, you wouldn't necessarily expect that from a film by Rob. I mean, I do. I think the quiet moments are what impressed me the most with 3 from Hell, and I think that maybe he doesn't get enough credit for taking these choices of showing those emotional beats in films that maybe, he does deserve more credit for that.
And you mentioned resentment, and I think there's the resentment where it goes both ways, but you also get the sense that Laurie, to a certain extent, is comparing what the two of them lost and resenting, almost feeling like a charity case. Like she is still, not only does she have to cope with the physical and emotional trauma of what she suffered, but she's also lost her only family. Like she had to, so she's also still mourning the loss of her parents, and, waking up in a different home than she had grown up in is a reminder of that every single day. I kind of want to circle back to just the very, very beginning of the movie. Sure. I love the opening shots of just Laurie holding the gun and walking quietly through a completely deserted Haddonfield where the streets are empty. It's pouring rain, because without any dialogue, without anything except just watching her just hobble down these lonely stretches of road, you get a complete sense of just, there's no bouncing back from this.
Totally.
And it's so different from what we normally see in this kind of film, where, we covered Scream. I love the Scream movies, and we talked a little bit about, what Sidney Prescott goes through. But by and large, aside from some minor cosmetic things overall and some minor changes, like, she's not terribly affected by the events of the movie, right? I mean, fair to say, and I think that's the case in a lot of slasher movies where the final characters return. There's some superficial dealings with in terms of trauma and what the blowback is going to be. And here, I think very early on, you get the feeling that like it's set up so there's no coming back from this.
No, totally. And I think what makes that scene that you're talking about so powerful is not just the imagery, but the lack of sound. And I think that that's one of the most impressive things about this film is, even though it's very brutal at times, most times, I think the choice to make those moments almost silent, like, it makes the film that much, like, maybe not scary, but kind of panic inducing. Laurie is kind of fucked up beyond repair. All that stuff, but instead of doing these really dramatic string-filled, musical cues while she's walking, it's silent, and it gives you as a viewer a chance to kind of feel that, and I think the lack of sound kind of helps set that tone in that scene, especially.
After watching this movie again this week in preparation for the episode, I kind of come to a realization that I missed maybe the first few times I watched watched it. I get the feeling watching this movie that the director's point of view is that Michael Myers is very much the wronged party in the Halloween movies overall, that he is the one that the audience should be sympathizing with. And we talked a little bit about that when we discussed Halloween. This movie, to me, the character of Michael Myers really echoes the character of the monster in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, because when I'm watching it, and this is a cosmetic thing, but I know that Rob has said he replaced Dag Farrick because he thought the actor had kind of aged out a little bit of the role when they were doing the flashback scene in the hospital.
Uh-huh.
I would make the argument that at least at some level, whether aware or unaware of it, looking at the actor Chase Wright in that scene, he's a cuter kid. I mean, it sounds like a really weird thing, and he just like Dag Farrick is perfect in his role as that little young Michael Myers, and he's made up to look very creepy. When I look at Chase Wright, he's kind of a handsome smile. You see like Michael Myers like smiling and talking to his mom and to Sherry Moon Zombie in that scene. Mm-hmm. You don't see that in any of Rob Zombie's Halloween. He's never really smiling or really laughing at all. And even when he is, it's creepy. This is just like a very clear-eyed.
That's also kind of the point, though. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the point of that scene, because when his mom is there, mm-hmm. and that's his sunshine. That's the way.
No, that's a good thing. I'm not arguing that's a bad thing. I'm not arguing at all that it's a bad thing. I think that I do agree that that's the point of it overall, and you want to have him look at this bright, cheerful little guy here. But I would argue that like it posits that Loomis is really the monster of the movie or overall, and even to the point that everyone in the movie that dies, almost with a couple of exceptions, everyone in the movie that's a victim in this movie almost deserves it in one way or another. You have
there's very few people. Yeah, there's very few people in Halloween 2 that die, undeservedly. And I'm not saying anyone deserves to die, but a lot of Michael's victims in the second one are kind of people that kind of were antagonistic.
Correct.
And, speaking on what you're talking about, the moments between Michael and his mom that were kind of, endearing in Rob's first film, they still felt very off kilter. And I think one of the interesting things in Halloween 2, that kind of on what you're speaking on, is that actor. It is easy to see that actor as young Michael and feel for him. And mm-hmm. that's another thing that I've always found fascinating about Halloween 2, and kind of speaking on where, it's more about the monster. Michael kind of comes off, for the first time in the entire series for me, Michael comes off very lonely in Halloween 2. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's such an interesting choice to give this monster kind of this loneliness and kind of like tragedy to him that's never been in a single Halloween film prior.
Well, and this goes back to my point on this film being rooted in reality, because mm-hmm. one of the other things that this movie does is it spends real time with him.
Yeah.
In most of these movies, it's exposition explaining how he gets from point A to B. Or it's maybe just one scene, like the gas station in Part 4 or something like that. Like his survival is never made a point of feature in any of the other films. Whereas this is the first time, and really in the genre, maybe outside of Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. No, I can't say that totally, but it's one of the few times where you're seeing how he would live under the radar as like a 7-foot serial killer who should be instantly recognizable by anybody after the events of the first film. Of course, he's going to be transient. How do transients survive? They wear layers and layers of clothing. Would they be unkempt? Of course they would. So that's why he has the beard and the long hair. Where would they go? He can't be in town because he'll be seen there. So he sort of lives on the fringes. He's out in the fields and, rurally and things like that. And it's the discussions with his mom that eventually lead him back to all this stuff in Haddonfield. But I love that this movie gives us the rare view of one of these characters just sort of living and surviving. And so as a result of that, you do have a lot more screen time with him. Like with him having even a portion of his face. Do you guys remember what a big deal that was when it was revealed?
Yeah.
Because I think it might have been Fango that did an article on it, and they said, we are in a room right now full of a bunch of little Michael Myers, and Michael's face is exposed or something like that. And the internet blew up because they're all like, they're taking the mask off Michael, blah, 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 blah. Well, he does have the mask off because it's completely impractical to walk around every fucking day wearing a full head mask if you want to live. And in Rob's universe, Michael Myers is human.
Totally. And I think it's also interesting that, maybe it's explored a little more in the director's cut, but I think it's very interesting that the character of Michael, it's not just, some of my favorite Halloween films are like this too. But in the past ones, Michael's kind of a POV. Michael's kind of like the shark from Jaws, to quote Buster Rhymes, going after his victim. Where this movie, Michael is very much a character that you get to experience, to follow. And a lot of his anger in this movie comes from the feeling of feeling betrayed by Loomis.
Right.
Loomis, obviously Michael is the villain, but to me, Loomis comes off more
monstrous,
more of an antagonist than Michael does. Mm-hmm. Loomis has benefited so much from the tragedy of, Michael's family and Laurie, and I feel like that is more than Laurie, but I think Loomis is kind of the force that brings Michael's anger in this movie. He feels betrayed.
Well, it's even, because you get the shots where, Michael is speaking to his ghost mom and you hear her say, like, everyone is profiting off us. Everyone's profiting off our tragedy. It's not just Loomis that's doing it, in a very big way, but also like the Red Rabbit strip club. You have like Daniel Roebuck's character, Lou Martini. He has Michael's mother plastered all over the place. And it's like the mother of the angel of death. Like he's profiting off of the tragedy as well overall. And to me, even the character of Annie's death, like you had mentioned, Justin, the character, you mentioned the Frankenstein of the Bride of Frankenstein, and I couldn't help but think of the character of the monster in Shelley's novel, who we grow to sympathize with, basically killing off Victor Frankenstein's friends and family one by one, and that Annie dies in this movie basically is payback to Sheriff Brackett, saying, you're the one that took away my sister. You took away Boo from me. Yeah. She is the only thing I ever loved. And if you're going to remove the only thing I ever loved, then I'm going to destroy something you love too. And I think there's something very much that parallels Frankenstein in that way. The hillbillies that attack Michael, they attack Michael, and you could say what he's doing is retaliation or self-defense, although it's amplified quite a little bit. But I think very much the point of view of this movie is that Michael is the one you're supposed to sympathize with at the end.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jerry. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, Justin mentioned that this film is the one mostly rooted in reality. And the last time I watched Halloween 2 this week, it reminded me of, I can't remember the real man's name, but there was a movie, and this is another weird comparison in this episode. There was a film that came out a couple years ago called Aftermath with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he plays a loving father and husband, and this kind of careless air control worker wasn't paying attention, and the plane crashed with Schwarzenegger's family on it. And he felt like this man took something from him. This man had no remorse. No remorse, nothing in real life. The real story, the guy had no remorse, nothing. So the father just wanted to return that loss. So he hunted down this air traffic controller that took his family from him and killed him basically in front of his family. And it's kind of the same thing in Halloween 2, like you're saying. I feel like most of Michael's actions are led by either retaliation or, like I said, betrayal for feeling like Loomis basically profited over the blood of, all these people, his family especially, and Michael did kill his sister and all those things. He's very much a villain, but at the same time, in Rob's films, Michael's a human being and goes through these complex kind of feelings like everyone else does. And no other Halloween film prior kind of showed us that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, and you had mentioned sympathizing with Michael, and I would challenge that by saying, I think it's more getting a glimpse into Michael's world as opposed to sympathizing with him. And in this story, it's not just him, it's also his mom and that deep connection with her and how she's kind of helping guide him to the people who had done her wrong too. And so the Rabbit in Red isn't just about the exploitation. It's also like, she maybe hated working there, and she was, it's not just him, in other words. It's a larger story to be told there. And so it's like in Frankenstein, it's almost like you can't, when he throws the girl in the lake, and he doesn't know. He just thinks that's how you play. He saw her throw the pedal in, so he threw her in. And how do you fault that guy? Because he just is and sees things how he does. And it's the same thing in Rob's Halloween 2, where it might seem, based on our history of being conditioned by film tropes, that he is a sympathetic character in this, or should be viewed as a sympathetic character. But really, I think there's a greater story happening here where he's almost working off of instinct from front to back in this, from survival to getting rid of the people that he gets rid of. And it is all rooted in the complexity, Jerry, that you just mentioned, that I think is arguably the root of what makes this whole thing so fascinating.
What's crazy is, I feel like even though it's directed by the same person, I feel like the character of Michael is a complete 180 from the 2007 film. I mean, like Mike and I discussed on the previous episode, our feelings are, I'm pretty sure Mike said this, so don't quote me, maybe it's just my feelings, but Michael kind of knows what the hell he's doing in 2007. It's very calculated, it seems like he's 100%, he knows exactly what he's doing, everything from killing the bully to, Ronnie and all that other stuff. Whereas Halloween 2, like you're saying, it feels like he's led by something bigger than just, what he wants to do. And I feel like,
but maybe he was in the first one too.
Maybe he was, but I feel like as a filmmaker, no, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
That might've been Rob's intention, but I feel like Rob 100% is successful in doing that in this film, maybe not so much in the first film. And I think that's what makes 2 kind of stand out a lot for me, is that, maybe Rob doesn't get enough credit for kind of, a lot of people say his writing is where it suffers, where I think, like I said, 3 from Hell, I think it's so well written, and I think that his writing is very just on point and good in Halloween 2 in ways that, like, even from Halloween, his first film to his second film, I feel like there's such growth being displayed.
I think the biggest thing it benefits from is it dials back a lot of the white trash stuff. And, it can be tough to watch at times with Laurie's character being like really over the top and screaming and yelling. But I think it's understandable in this movie, given the history, definitely. So I'm more forgiving of it. And I think it dials back a lot of the kind of trashier elements of the first movie overall. And I think you guys have both said this one is rooted in a more reality. Like, to me, this is a more recognizable reality overall. Like, this is something that doesn't feel like completely exaggerated. And I can appreciate that. And I think that kind of pulls me into the movie more.
Well, totally. And, for the longest time, I've spent years, even in the last episode or so, briefly talking about Laurie in Halloween 2, how I just don't get how after all that stuff, she would just be this kind of hard to like, kind of, Charles Manson obsessy kind of thing. And just rewatching it this last week, it's just like, I kind of felt, I mean, I don't know, maybe getting older, I see things differently, but I kind of feel like, who am I to say how someone would react to, their whole life getting changed like that? How I reacted to my own trauma growing up is completely different than the next person.
Right.
So, I mean, I do think that it is interesting that he went that direction with her.
And one of the things I do love is that I love seeing Laurie in a Black Flag shirt in this.
Right.
To relate it a little bit to myself, when I was 19, my dad passed, and we were pretty close overall. Like, I know I had 19 good years with him overall, and I know a lot of people have like 40 or 50 shitty years with their parents sometimes. I had 19 good ones with mine, so yay for me. But it was a really hard time, and I had just been starting to get into like punk and hardcore music in a year or two before, and when he passed, I completely dived into it. And I remember basically just listening to nothing but like Husker Du, The Descendants, and Black Flag on a loop, all for different reasons. And over time, like dropping out of school and just spending every waking moment at punk clubs overall, like, shaving my head completely bald, just like sleeping in alleyways some nights because I would miss a train back to wherever I was living, like couch surfing and like having a really hard go of it for a while. And, for me, I would say like punk rock saved my life. And I know that's a cliche phrase, but it really did. So a small part of me really obviously didn't go through anything like what the characters go through in here, but to me, one of the one cathartic and joyous moments of the film are when Laurie and this kind of new family of friends that she's adopted with Bray Grant's character throw on Kick Out the Jams.
Yeah.
They hit on MC5 and Kick Out the Jams, and that to me was an immediately recognizable moment, and I just love that so much. Even if the dude from WKRP in Cincinnati is kind of a creeper in that role, but that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, again, everybody is. You can buy into it because they're relatable people, and because all of the conflict, the filmmakers' conflict about carrying forward elements from the original are gone now. It's now, it can be whatever the playing field needs to be for this story. And in this story, and I like what you say, Jerry, about her trauma. Like, everyone is so completely different with anything like that. I mean, no one can cast judgment on her performance in that. I mean, I would, I've always been really bothered by the suggestion, usually by men, that it's an unrealistic portrayal of how Laurie should be or would be, because, I mean, you don't know.
Right.
And so, yeah.
What do we think of the contrast, though, between how Laurie is depicted versus Annie and Danielle Harris's much quieter, more kind of insular, one day at a time portrayal of survival overall? Like, I want to say she's agoraphobic. I don't think Annie ever leaves the home in this. I could be wrong, but I don't remember her ever leaving the Brackett home. And she's obviously still like very damaged from everything that goes on, but is handling it in a much different way, almost taking on, like, she almost becomes a mother to both her father, Sheriff Bracken, and obviously to Laurie as well.
Well, I feel like, I mean, she kind of has to, though. I mean, how many times, if we're in relationships or, I mean, siblings, marriages, anything where you're both going through such hard times and you both have such different ways to deal with it, even though you're hurting, even though Annie's hurting, she very much sees this friend who used to have everything together fall apart. She kind of is forced to be this mother, mother hen to her. And I my issues with Laurie Strode initially with this movie, like, that's whatever, but I can't stress enough how great I think Danielle Harris is in this movie. Because it kind of shows what I was speaking on, how everyone deals with trauma in their own way. And I love how both characters are flipped upside down to who they were in the first film. Annie was that kind of braggadocious, what the fuck you looking at? My daddy's a sheriff kind of, person.
Mm-hmm.
And Laurie was, she was a little rebellious in the first film, but she was very much, more soft-spoken and that kind of stuff. Whereas in Halloween 2, because of what happened, they're very much the opposite. And it's very interesting to see. It's also interesting to see, I think, Brad Dourif as Loomis, or not Loomis, I mean Brackett, Brad Dourif as Brackett, and his performance is so good. I mean, yeah, that epic scene where he finds Annie's body, but also, I mean, he is fighting tooth and nail just to keep those girls okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the most endearing scenes in the whole series is that kind of like pizza scene between all three of them, where like Brackett is fighting so hard just to like help them and be there for him, but he's kind of losing and he knows it,
Yeah, he knows it's really like an uphill climb that he's just not up to task for as much as he would love to be.
And he probably also carries guilt from the events of the first film too. And that's something that you're not usually allowed to see either emotion in law enforcement in films, unless that's like the heart of the story, is very, very rare.
Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciate the fact that he's sympathetic here and that we get that dinner table scene. And I get where Annie would be, because she, in many ways, had the worst experience with the first film. Obviously, she was. I mean, her murder is what we all assumed had happened. She was brutalized in that movie, and so how she's going to respond to it is very much her own path. And at the same time, I could see her being sick of this being a threat in her life, being burned out on dealing with Laurie and her constant sort of reminders about what happened, because she's trying to move on too. And that's the hard thing. Like when a couple loses a child or something, that you are having individual experiences, but there's also a together experience. And those are going to be three very different things. And the complexity, getting a chance to see that here is, I think, a really remarkable thing, because the dynamics would naturally change. Of course that's going to happen. And these aren't caricatures. And I mean, the feelings, as somebody who's had extreme stress at certain points in my life and gone through some horrible things. I mean, of course not attempted murder, but when Laurie's in the therapy session and she's just screaming, about, and when she's in the car and she has this great revelation about Michael and her relationship to Michael in this one, she's beating on the steering wheel with the book. And because it's this huge thing that she had no idea has always been there in her life. I have been in that moment. I have been in that very moment. And I know how it crushed me and how I'm continuing to work through everything, that all of the ripples that have come since then. So, yeah.
I think, too, there's that moment at the end of the pizza scene that Jerry referenced to, where when Laurie runs from the table to throw up, Brackett looks at Annie and she's like, "Yep, I'm going. I always go." And it's a little line, but in that line you get just this complete picture of what life has been like for the past 2 years. Annie has been the one that's held Laurie's hair back when she's thrown up from stress and fear. She's been the one to comfort her. She's been the one to tell her that, it's going to be all right. She's opened up her home to her. She's given up all this space to her overall. So their friendship, looks so much different than it was. And you get this feeling that deep down, Annie is asking, who's there to hold me? Who's there to pick me up when I need it? Who's there to tell me it's going to be all right? She wasn't getting, that same comfort overall. And there's a little bit of, when she says, I'm over your shit, you weren't the only person that was hurt that night. And you get a feeling it's the first time that she's ever expressed that feeling. And I don't think she could ever really start healing until she was able to express that.
And it's so
thread back. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was, if I can draw a thread back to Rob's first film, that this isn't the first time. I mean, all of this isn't new for him in his Halloween universe, because don't forget about Judith Myers in the first movie, who, in another rarity in horror, outside of the third Creature from the Black Lagoon film, we have a main character committing suicide on screen. And it's the result of what she's been through and her being completely overwhelmed, which is not an unreasonable response when your child has done what he did and she's dealing with all she is. The baby's screaming in the room. She has all this, like her world is wrapped up in chaos, and she does that to herself, which is not only taking, once again, the Halloween mythology into a new realm, but it's also, it's allowing humans to be fallible and allowing us the fragility that we all ultimately do have, instead of just being movie characters that can jump across buildings and be shot 100 times and then get back up. You know what I mean?
And it shows how different people are. You know, some people work on themselves when they go through a lot. Some people fold. And the thing with Sherry, especially in the first film, with killing herself, I mean, can you imagine that character, like what they would have to live with, knowing that their son murdered basically the entire family, so to speak, you know? Like that weight, like that is one of the things I do like about that movie, is that scene, you know? Like it shows the kind of like pain in her eyes, knowing that she has to live with this, you know?
And the way he shoots it is so poignant. And I remember sitting in the theater on opening night, or on opening day rather, watching that film the first time. And when that gunshot went off and you hear the baby scream, it was dead silence in the theater. Because in the first movie, that's the point where you knew that this is going to be, I mean, obviously quite a bit happened before then with Halloween night and everything that happened with Michael. But that's the moment of new that really let you know that you weren't safe in this world. And then from that point forward, that was one of the, I think, that the sort of most important elements of the first one, to just put audience, to disarm the audience in a way.
That, and I think it's interesting how Rob flipped a lot of characters from the original series. I mean, it's fun, especially with Halloween 2, to think about how he took, you know, while I don't necessarily like the direction with this character, it is interesting that he took the character who, you know, for all intents and purposes, was the savior in the first 6 movies and made him the most unlikable character in both of his films with Loomis. I mean, Loomis in Halloween 2, like I said, I've always found him to be more of an antagonist than Michael in the movie. Like up until the end, you know, where he kind of realizes, whoa, what have I done? You know, the whole movie, I mean, he's trying to sleep with reporters. You know, and it's interesting. There's that one scene that almost feels like Rob is talking to all of his critics, where they have that picture of Loomis kind of in the Donald Pleasance trench coat, you know, and he throws a fit saying, you know, that's the old Loomis, I'm the new Loomis, you know, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that one's a bit on the nose.
Yeah. You know, I do think it's interesting that character became kind of, in a lot of ways, almost a secondary villain.
Oh, absolutely. And that began in his first film too, because if you remember, Loomis's conversations with young Michael, well, not young Michael, but like adult, 18-year-old, whatever, 19-year-old Michael, was centered around the fact that he's like, I can't do anything else for you. He's a doctor who had given up. He had thrown in the towel, and he was just there that day to tell Michael that he was done. And so it wasn't as though he was a hero in that. And also, I would argue, historically in the Halloween franchise, and I know I said this so many times too, Loomis is the at once greatest opportunity and greatest missed opportunity in the entire franchise, because we spend so little time getting to know him. And this is when we were on the Halloween 4 episode, you guys, we talked about the scene in the truck when he smiles for maybe the only time in the entire franchise outside of scaring the kid at the bush in the original. And you get a little glimpse into his mind and him meeting the Reverend. Sort of, he's seeing a little bit of a mirror of himself, and he sees the joy in this man. And I think he sort of pulls from that. Loomis was always, he wasn't a hero because he never really saved the day. He was really, I mean, selfish and brutal to children in part 4 and 5, especially in part 5. In part 6, he's kind of ineffective. In part 1 and 2, especially 1, he's just tailing Michael. He's not ultimately, I mean, until the very, very end of the film, which is the same thing in the original Halloween 2, he's, for as important as we have made him over time, and for a lot of people saying the yin to the yang, Michael to Loomis. You think about how little he actually does in the franchise. And so Rob integrates that here, and he modeled him in the second film after Vincent Bugliosi,
Yes.
Yeah.
who wrote the book about the Manson murders called Helter Skelter. And and much has been made of him really making everything in the wake of that book about himself. And he was known for that anyway. And so these people, I mean, Loomis, for all intents, by the time Rob's Halloween 2 comes around, he doesn't know Michael's out there. He assumes he's probably dead. Who knows? But he's kind of moving on. He's no longer practicing. And so now he's moved into the realm of celebrity. Well, we can certainly, as horror fans, understand that, because how many times do you go to conventions and pay $30 for an autograph from someone who hasn't made a movie in 40 years? They've moved into the celebrity realm outside of the acting realm. This is just a natural transition. And as a guy who had already thrown in the towel in part 1 on a guy that he could have arguably probably continued to work with and maybe made progress at some point with,
we're going to have some words.
He then, by the time part 2 comes around, this isn't even relevant to his world outside of a money-making venture. So I get it. And I'm glad it's not the same old Loomis.
So I made this argument when when Nat and I talked about part 1. One of the biggest problems I had with Dr. Loomis in the original series is he had no business treating Michael Myers for that long as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, if he was having no effect and if his treatments were having no effect on him. The line, I spent like 8 years, looking at, trying to get through to him, and then another 7 years trying to keep him locked up forever. It's like he, ethically speaking, is a practicing counselor. If the treatment you're doing is having no effect, you are ethically bound to find somebody else to treat that person at that point. So I, when you say like, well, he could have gotten through to him.
Maybe.
What I loved about part 1, and I'm actually working on a piece about this right now, is I love Loomis's portrayal in part 1 up to and including the bit where he has that goodbye with Michael and he says, "I'm sorry. I wish I could treat you. I wish that I could fix this, but I just can't." And you could see, and you have never seen this in any of the other Halloween movies. You've never seen Loomis actually try to treat Michael. You are not privy to any of the treatments that he used, what sort of modalities, nothing at all. You never got any real attempt to see them establish any sort of rapport with one another. And I think in like Zombie's original Halloween movie, you do see the character of Michael and Loomis establish a pretty good rapport initially with one another. And over time, before Michael withdraws, when he realizes he's never getting out. And you can see Loomis's heart break in each subsequent scene a little more and a little more until he realizes, like, I cannot help you. And I can tell you that as a counselor, I've had that conversation with people where I'm like, I wish I could help you, but what you're going through is so much outside of the realm of what I'm able to do that I would be doing you more harm than good to continue to see you. What we are going to do is find you someone that can be better suited for you.
Well, he's so far from that scene that you mentioned in the first film where you could see his heart kind of breaking when he realizes that. Yes. He's so far from that. And I think a good example is at the kind of event that he's speaking at, where it's not even talking about his history with Michael. I mean, he starts making like little like ad-lib jokes
with
about
the Loomis
Michael.
Twist. Yes, it's
and it's just like it's so exploitative. Like I think it's a fun flip side to Donald Pleasance's character because I mean, me personally, I love that character, and I think in the original series there is that moment where Loomis realizes that he completely fucked up the whole thing, and it's the moment at the end of Halloween 5 when Loomis had the heart attack. He looks at Michael and there's a look of all these years I've failed you, And I think that's interesting. I think one of the things that makes Halloween 2 work is having Loomis be that despicable. because I mean, like I said earlier, I feel like that is a driving force into Michael coming home and not only giving revenge, but kind of coming to terms with how exploited he feels. I do feel like the Michael in Halloween 2, and 2007 as well, but this is the first time zombies films, especially, these are the first times you get to feel what Michael's feeling, and I mean, I'm not, I love Halloween 5 with a passion, but one lonely teardrop coming down Don Shank's face isn't the same as the whole journey that we go with on Michael with Halloween 2.
Agree. No, agree. And you mentioned the moment where he's at the convention. Also, just the way he treats his assistant, where he's like, if I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you. It's like it's a completely unrecognizable character from the first movie, and it's an odd choice, but I think it strengthens my argument that Loomis is really meant to be the villain here. Even at the end, when he, makes the choice to go to the shack where there's the standoff, he's completely ineffectual. He's in over his head. He's ineffectual, and
it's all about him.
Yes, it's all about what he wants to do. And he goes into that shack, and within 10 seconds, he's like, nope, this is way too much crazy. I have no idea how to deal with this.
No, like Brackett and all the cops, they're doing their best to not only control the situation, but get everyone out of it safe, Laurie and that. Mm-hmm. And what Loomis does, it's very selfish, and it might come off heroic to some, but disregarding Brackett asking him to not go in there, I think is very selfish, and actually it could put Laurie and everyone in danger more than they already were, because it adds another roadblock to them trying to get Michael, and I feel like that speaks that action at the end speaks so much on the Loomis in Halloween 2.
It does. No, it absolutely, it really does. And you can see, he is definitively killed in this one, like he wasn't in the first movie. I thought, in the theatrical cut, his head is pretty much crushed, but he somehow comes back in this one. I think at the end of this movie, it's interesting because I think Malika Akkad had told, Rob, like, basically do whatever you want, and if that means killing the creature, then kill him, which his dad always had a aversion to, and that was a hard, fast rule. Like, you're not allowed to kill Michael, to the point where he had a backup plan for Michael getting his head chopped off at the end of H2O. He's like, nope, just a flesh wound. We can get over this. Here, it's like, if you want to kill Michael, then go ahead and do so. And the end of this movie sees your three main characters, Michael, Laurie, and Loomis, all dead, with really nowhere to go once this movie ends. Like, I don't know where you could have gone with this movie after this one, or this franchise after this.
Well, what's interesting is they kind of tried. Yeah. I mean, it should have been the end of that kind of set of stories, but I mean, it's funny that they... Oh, no, me too, 100%. I like the finality of it. I think it's funny that, they even tried to make a third one to this exact series, Like, it's interesting.
What do we think of the White Horse stuff?
I like it, but at the same time, I also think it speaks on how, like, off the cuff, Rob can be. Kind of like bouncing off the walls, like, oh, I see a white horse while we're driving to set. Let me incorporate that. And I think that that's one of the things that I love a lot about Lords of Salem, is there's so many decisions in that film, especially, where it's just kind of like, you know what, maybe we don't have the time or the budget to do this, or maybe I like what we're doing this much more. Let's go this direction. And it's interesting because the white horse is so prevalent in the film. But it was almost like there's a white horse. I think I'll incorporate that into the script. But I do think it works for it.
It does, because this movie is about relationships.
Yeah,
and it's about a connection with youth, with his past. His past being his mother, his past being comfort at home, his sister, and all of that. So we all have things. Like, my son carries around this little stuffed dog, Bella. And that's like his connection to comfort. And I know when I was a kid, I had a blanket that I used to carry around and I hold on to the little tag on the corner of it. And when I've been in the hospital at any point in my life, I always had something with me that connected me with home or the people I loved or whatever it might be. This is something that very rarely happens in movies. People very rarely, because the stories don't usually expand to consider the small elements like that, whereas this one does. And I love that it becomes a key visual element in this movie because it makes it distinctive. It is something completely different and completely unexpected, but he's still seeing the world in some ways through child's eyes. And he's still, he's holding on to when he was hospitalized, if you're in a psych ward, you're not going to be able to have much of anything. If you're in a psychiatric hospital or under any kind of care, the tables can't be lifted off the ground. There's because they're trying to prevent suicide and self-harm every way they can. And so you may have one or two things that you can keep that are your own. Everything else is in storage downstairs and will be taken out when you leave. This makes sense that Michael would have been allowed something. And for his mom to give him that in an attempt to bring some sort of normalcy to his world while he was in there. And Sherry is so wonderful in that scene because you can see the pain inside of her in part 2 when she goes to visit Michael at the hospital, because he's saying, can I just come home? And she's, I wish you could. And I wish you could understand how big this thing is, but you're just a kid. And handing him this makes all the sense in the world. His doctor, he's in this sterile universe where he's just a patient, and they may feign interest in him ultimately, but you know how the doctor-patient relationship is, especially in a hospital like that. It's not heart to heart. And so he needs his mom, and he needs to feel her presence, and that horse represents that. And so when he comes out, when he sort of reemerges as the sort of monster again, why would he stop holding on to the conduit to his one place of comfort that he had when all this shit went haywire in the first place? I think in many ways it should have been there in the first film as well, and I wish it would have been.
And I think too, the white horse is there in a lot of ways from a narrative standpoint to give voice to Michael's inner thoughts in a way that none of the other movies had done. And I think one of the strengths of it overall is it shows that despite the fact that you have Tyler Mane, who's this 6'10" monster of a man, just ginormous, and you can lose sight of the fact that developmentally Michael is still that 10-year-old boy, that he's never really moved past that, and that his way of thinking is this very rigid, very childlike way of thinking, and that 10-year-old is trapped inside a body of a 25-year-old man that is just too large and too monstrous for this world.
Well, it kind of goes with what you were saying about revenge. Loomis not Loomis. I don't know. I keep saying Loomis. Brackett, took this away from me, so I'm going to take this away from him. If Michael is kind of stunted in that younger mindset, that makes even more sense with that. Because, as children, we are kind of not bratty like that, but we are kind of vindictive like that. You take my toy, I'm going to take your toy. Yeah. And even as teenagers, this person broke my heart, so obviously I'm going to be a dick to them now.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's that kind of almost immaturity to it that is kind of addressed in Halloween 2. Michael is very much, he might be a Hulk, visually, but he's still very much that kid who misses his mom, and that might sound silly to say in a Halloween movie, but it's the truth,
And that scene where he's on the sidewalk walking, and that little kid bumps into him, and it's a little bit of levity where the kid says, "Are you a giant?" And he looks, and Michael looks down at him. Michael's looking at a normal kid out doing normal Halloween stuff, and that's what gives him pause in that moment. He doesn't annihilate the kid. He's not Jason Voorhees.
Right.
It's just a moment because he's not out to be a killing machine. He's not necessarily driven by any one specific thing. And this is what I'm talking about, where it is so rooted in the reality of what his world would be like.
Agree.
Totally.
Yep, totally agree with that. Yeah, it's not, one of my favorite scenes in the 2018 Halloween is that kind of like single take of Michael making his way home to home and going on that spree. And to me, it's very much like a gleeful kid in a candy store. I don't know if anyone remembers the show Bozo the Clown when they were growing up.
Yeah.
But they used to have this. One of the contests was you, as a kid, you would get like a shopping cart and you would have like 1 minute to go through like a Toys R Us, and anything you could get off the shelf and get over the line is what you would win. And that's what that scene is like in 2018's Halloween. It's like, how I'm just going to go nuts right now. And this is not that movie. And I think it's, I love the 2018 Halloween. I think it's great. I think that this portrayal of Michael right here it really works for me in the 2009 Halloween 2. It really works for me for that reason. Like you said, like he's not only you want to say spares the kid. I don't think it ever crosses his mind to even hurt the kid.
Of course not.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
No, totally. And it also speaks on what Justin said earlier about each film existing on its own. I loved the 2018 film with a passion. I mean, it's my second favorite Halloween film. But with that being said, I do like that Halloween 2, like you said, is definitely not that movie. I like the fact that two very different movies can exist on their own and be very different takes on the same character. I find it very fascinating. And I'm happy to say that, I'm converted in that sense. Like, it's cool to find kind of an appreciation in a movie that maybe I just wasn't ready to kind of digest. And I think that it has so much going on for it in a positive way, in an entertaining way. It has a lot of good statements about, trauma and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I love how it just shows the aftermath of everything. It's great.
Let me ask you guys a question here, because I'm not sure if you already have notes to head into this realm. But what do you guys think bothers people so much about this movie, and why do you think it's so polarizing?
Okay, so I was just going to go into that a little bit. I said really early in the podcast how it doesn't feel like a Halloween movie. I think part of it is it suffers because a lot of people, even though the original Halloween or original Rob Zombie Halloween did very well at the box office, I don't think a lot of people love that movie. I think that they came out of it with a pretty sour taste in their mouth, and this one's going to suffer by comparison. I think the hospital scene being a dream sequence and kind of being an FU to fans overall might sour people a little bit. Jerry, you had said, all right, all those things you don't like about my movie, I'm going to amplify those things right now. Michael is not in his mask for long stretches of this movie, and that is so different from anything because, to your point, Justin, he really shouldn't be, because it would look ridiculous to see him just kind of wandering around in a Will Shatner mask. And I don't think people like hobo Michael Myers.
Well, that, and I think it kind of goes with any fandom in general. I mean, I think we saw that with The Last Jedi with the Star Wars series. Mm-hmm. It was so different that a lot of people were just like, nope, I hate it with a passion. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's what Halloween 2 was for this series. They didn't – seeing Michael Myers get karate kicked by Busta Rhymes wasn't as offensive to them as Michael not being in his mask in Halloween 2, which I find incredibly odd.
Right.
Or a senior citizen cult, driving Michael Myers around after he impregnated Jamie wasn't as weird as, a white horse, which I find is incredibly weird.
To be fair, this movie had a much bigger audience than, say, Halloween 6 did.
No, but
people,
what I mean is
people just stopped going to see those movies where, Halloween, Rob Zombie's Halloween, and this one, like a lot of people watch these movies.
No, I don't mean like box office wise. I mean like as far as reception. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not just lately that there's been that kind of resurgence of Halloween 6 fans. I mean, that's been going on for a while, I feel like that they're a lot more dismissive of a movie that goes for broke as far as being completely different than a movie that maybe is just silly.
But I think that's in part because a lot more people are now catching up with Halloween 6, like as opposed to it being ignored upon release to a large extent.
That's true. That's
where
true.
a lot of people saw this and had, initial opinions on it overall. I think that's a guess on my part.
Well,
I could be completely wrong.
I also think that, by Halloween 6, I mean, it was kind of diminishing by that point as far as quality in their eyes. This movie, it was more of a slap to the face of those kind of toxic fandoms, because the first Halloween made so much money and so many people went to see it, whether or not they liked it or, reception. A lot of people went to see it, and I knew a lot of fans of that movie, a lot of them actually, and when they go see a movie, they expect it to be a follow-up of that movie. Like I said, it's directed by the same person, but it's very much a different film,
Right.
It's like, it would be kind of like, and I'm not going to talk about this movie so much because I've gotten enough hate mail over this movie, but it's like if you watch the original Black Christmas and then you watch the new one back to back, if the new one was a sequel to the original, not a remake like it is. Can you imagine like how pissed off people would be, even more than they already are, about that movie? Like, it's not even the same movie.
Right. They're completely different things that share a same name. Why do you think, Justin, like, what is it? What would you say the reaction? Why would you say people have had such a visceral negative reaction to this movie? Well, we're here. Like, I've ranked this one as high as number 2 in terms of like where it sits in the franchise for me.
Yeah, it's my number 2 as well. I think that people don't like to be confronted with uncomfortable things. And I think a lot of horror is very safe, and you can feel very removed when Jason's folding someone in half or when Freddy's in the dream world. And I think that this movie, it puts the audience in the uncomfortable position of being in a therapy session. It puts them with the sheriff when he discovers that his daughter's been murdered. You're spending time with Michael in a puzzling universe that in his head that there's no way we can comprehend because it's not for us to understand. So these are all very challenging things for an audience. And for people who are used to a somewhat of a model on the Halloween franchise, Rob smashed that to bits, especially with Halloween 2. And that's why so many people, I think, resent this. And in my years when I was working with the franchise and going to appearances and conventions and whatever else it might be, all anyone ever bitched and moaned about was the white horse. And I can't believe that it really boils down to that for so many people, because this movie is doing so much more than that. And if that's just the case, I would challenge them to go and revisit it with new eyes if they haven't watched it in a while, to reconsider it as a whole instead of just focusing on that one element. And also maybe think about, is that one element really that offensive? Why does this bother you so much? Is it simply because it's different? Is it because you don't normally watch films that move into the realm of fantasy outside of like a Star Wars type thing, which is still rooted within a reality of its own, right? I think that it's just such new territory for and I hate to use this word for it, but like a brand. It is such new territory and so fresh and unusual for people that I think, and I hate to say again, expectation, but it's almost like, it's so not what anybody thought they would be walking into the theater to see, that then they walk out with a resentment. Now, why they're so vocal about that, I think what I saw was bandwagoning. Because initially, I don't remember talking to people and having a lot of people going, I hate this movie.
Right.
Because it did well when it came out. It opened at like number 2, I think, and it went on to do almost $40 million. I mean, for a movie like this that costs like, 10 or 12 or something like that. And so it's not like it's a failure. And the studio, they completely mishandled the promotion on it. And so I don't think audiences knew what to expect walking into it necessarily. So it was an unusual situation where they were being handed something that's part of a larger mythology that takes that mythology and spins it on its head. And it does it in a way that is not conventional at all in terms of almost any of the storytelling that's happening in it. And that's why I think this movie really could stand on its own.
That, and I also feel like fans of a certain franchise will never be happy no matter what. I mean, we keep coming back to Star Wars here and there, but I mean, Force Awakens came out and people were complaining about how it's fan service and it's basically blah, blah, blah. It has too much of the original stuff. Last Jedi comes out and it's like, oh my God, it's so different. I hate it. The new one comes out and it's just like, well, it has too much of the old stuff. It's like, especially with horror, when it comes to like Halloween, Friday the 13th, a lot of this stuff. I feel like maybe a lot of fans, they want a certain thing, but when they get it, they want something else. It's just like, it's either, like I said, it's either too close or too far away. And I feel like a lot of people don't really give things a chance to, like Justin said, kind of, it be its own thing.
This movie also came at the
fault.
tail end of the remake phase too, though. Like, it came out in 2009, and I think this and then 2010's Nightmare on Elm Street really kind of put a nail in the coffin for big budget classic remakes that we had kind of sat through. It's also a lot of the horror of the early 2000s and mid 2000s was this really visceral, in your face, really grimy horror. And I think that was a reaction to 9/11, the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war. 2009, you have like a new, not to get too political, but you do have a new administration in office that was elected on the idea of hope and change. You see a shift in horror where, like, now the Saw movies are going to go away, and you start seeing more of a trend towards like paranormal type movies. I mean, let's not forget that about 2 months after Halloween 2 comes out, Paranormal Activity hits theaters, and on a budget of basically a Prius, makes over $100 million.
Mm-hmm. No, totally.
So I think maybe by this time fans are a little bit burned out on. I mean, because this is a tough movie to get through in terms of like just the sheer carnage of it overall. And I think as much as horror fans don't want to admit, like sometimes gore and bloodshed can be overwhelming. That there might be a little bit of a reaction to that as too, just based on where the next trend in horror went over the next few years. I mean, now you have Paranormal Activity. In 2011, you have Insidious. You have like the Conjuring universe right around the corner. All of those, I would say, are more old school scares as opposed to like blood and guts.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, I mean, I like a lot of those movies, a lot.
Oh, you can love
but
both.
But what I'm saying, like, with that being said, I can understand that a lot of those movies, I mean, the truth is a lot of them are product. One movie's successful, let's make another. That movie's successful, let's make another, and all that stuff. So when a film like Halloween 2 comes out right at the cusp of those breaking out, and it's a movie that, and it might be a product to a studio, but it's definitely not a product to its filmmaker. Like Halloween 2 is an art film. There's no arguing about it. This is a movie that should have been shown in an art theater, grimy art theater in like Pasadena or something, This is not like a Regal Theaters movie, And I feel like it came out maybe I think if Halloween 2 had come out maybe a couple years earlier, maybe it would have been received a little bit better. But I think, like you said, it was right before all that other stuff hit. And when that stuff hit, it hit hard, and it changed the landscape of what people were watching and what they were wanting.
Right. I love it. Absolutely love it. Gentlemen, the hour is getting late, at least on my end over here. What else do we have to add? I
think I'm good. I enjoyed this very much. Great episode.
Yeah. I adore this movie. I would encourage anyone that hasn't gone back and watched it in a while, give it a second chance. I really enjoy this a lot. It's, to me, it's got a little bit of nostalgic value. It's the first thing I wrote on for a site that I ran for close to a decade. And I loved it back then, and I appreciate more about it now.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I'm happy I came around too.
Justin, what are you working on, Mr. Beahm? What do you have coming up? What's in the pipeline for you?
The Big Trouble in Little China disc just came out, And I'm right now, let me think of what's been announced. I always struggle with this. I'm working on April Fool's Day. That's been announced. I'm working on Monster Go Home, rather. I'm working on a bunch of titles, but I can't honestly remember the ones that have been announced so far. But definitely lots of stuff for Scream Factory.
You have Body Bags and Let's Scare Jessica to Death coming out pretty soon too, right?
Oh, Body Parts. Yeah, Body Parts.
Oh, yeah, Body Parts, not Body Bags. Body Parts,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, the Eric Red film, that's right. And then Let's Scare Jessica to Death. I think they're coming up either later this month or next month in terms of their release. But both of those are in queue. And then, there's some stuff that I'm working on that I cannot wait for it to be announced. There's some really great titles that we're heading into 2020 with. And so people just really stay tuned to Shout Factory's social media and everything to keep up on that stuff. But that's really been my world, is just keeping the ball rolling with the production company and keeping these discs moving.
And I got to say, I never owned like a Shout Factory or Scream Factory release until you came on the show. It was always one of those things where I'm like, I'm not going to spend $25 on a disc. Come on. And I'm like, you know what? I need to own. Now I'm pretty much only buying the stuff you guys are putting out. We've got I just got the Howling Steelbook.
Oh,
and,
yes.
The Blob.
Good.
The Thing version you guys released, and there may or may not be a copy of They Live under the Christmas tree waiting for me right now, which I'm really excited about.
Thank you.
And who's coming up on the Justin Beahm Radio Hour soon?
Oh, the next episode, I'm actually going to start editing tomorrow. I have Michael Felshers on it with me.
Oh, nice.
And then I have, and we go for quite a while, and from Red Shirt Pictures, who is one of the contemporary godfathers of special features, and loved that conversation. And then I have a couple other people that are in queue coming up, but I have yet to record them, so I'm not going to jinx them by saying that. But thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
No problem. And where can folks find you online?
On all social media, just look my name up. My last name is Beahm, and also at justinbeahm.com, where I try to post things, keep it current with news and releases and stuff like that.
Excellent. Well, it's all of our, thank you again for coming on. Like, I always learn so much and just enjoy talking to you so much, to the point where I'm ready to just give up my seat and let you and Jerry run the show. And I'll just cheerlead from the sidelines like Flavor Flav.
No way. Well, thank you for inviting me back. I always appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. It is always a pleasure. Jerry, are we ready to do this again tomorrow night to do Muppets Christmas Carol?
Oh my God, I think so. I think I'm ready.
I think it will be shorter.
The Muppets Christmas Carol will be our Halloween 2 episode. Where it's so just like out there.
I love that. I've watched that 3 times already this season, and my daughter and I have had the soundtrack on repeat over and over. I've been reading articles on it from Paul Williams and Michael Caine. It's my 1A favorite Christmas movie. I probably just a hair behind It's a Wonderful Life, which we just did our family viewing of that tonight, and I always at the end of the movie, when Harry raises his glass and says to George Bailey, the richest man in town, like, I break down like a baby and just have to leave the room. Like, I'm not crying. There's nothing in my eyes here. You go to bed. You're grounded. Christmas is canceled.
It's great. It's a classic.
So I think next year, hopefully that'll win. That'll win. People ask, why wasn't Christmas Vacation part of the poll that we did? I would direct everybody to Saturday Night Sleepovers, who just covered that for a couple hours on their show, and they do such an incredible job of covering everything about that movie and really the history of National Lampoon and the Vacation series. That it's if you're looking for a amazing podcast on National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, go to just seek out Saturday Night Sleepovers, because they do an incredible job, and there's no way I would have been able to follow up the work they already did. So definitely seek that out if you need another Christmas show to listen to. And I think that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Follow us over at Pod and Pendulum over on Twitter. Thank you so much to our listeners. Justin, thank you. Jerry, thank you. Any final words?
Oh, thanks for listening.
All right. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy Hanukkah, and however you celebrate the holiday, do it with people you love. Have a great week. I'm getting all schmoopy. Have a great bye-bye. All right. I am going to...
Schmoopy.